The rain had been falling over Hartwell Grange since before dawn. A thin, persistent rain that did not so much fall as seep, the way grief seeps into a house long after the funeral bells have gone quiet. It came down grey and unhurried over the cracked chimney pots, over the ivy that had begun to swallow the east wing hole, over the gravel drive where weeds had pushed up between the stones because there was no longer a groundsman to pull them. Once Hartwell Grange had been spoken of in 3 counties as a jewel, its gardens laid out by a student of Repton himself, its ballroom floor polished so bright that dancers said they could see their own reflections spinning back at them. Now the ballroom held dust sheets over furniture no one could afford to sell, and the garden had gone to bramble, and the only sound in the house on a wet October afternoon was the drip of water finding its way through a seam in the roof that Mr. Bennett kept meaning to have mended. In the small back parlour, where the fire was allowed only 2 logs a day because coal had become a luxury remembered rather than purchased, Eleanor Bennett sat with a basket of mending in her lap and did not look up when the door opened. Still at that, her mother said, not as a question, "Mrs. Fitch's apron, Mama," and then the kitchen linens. Mrs. Bennett crossed to the window, where the grey light did her hair, still dark, still handsome, for she had been a beauty once, and had never quite forgiven time for taking it from her by degrees, no particular favours. She was looking, as she so often did, toward the drive, as though she might conjure a carriage out of the empty road by wanting one badly enough. "Your sister is trying on the blue muslin again," she said. "I told her it wants letting out at the waist, but she won't hear of it. She says a duke does not marry a woman who has let out her waist." Eleanor's needle paused over the linen. "A duke. The Kentmere contract, Eleanor. Don't tell me you've forgotten it, when it is the only thing standing between your father and debtor's prison." Mrs. Bennett said this lightly, the way one might mention the weather, though the words themselves were not light at all. "The old duke and your father settled it when you girls were children. A joining of the families. Some sum attached to it that will see us through, whichever daughter is chosen. The letter has come at last. The new duke means to call upon us within the fortnight to make his selection." "Which daughter?" Eleanor repeated softly. "Well, it will be Cassandra, of course. It was always going to be Cassandra." Her mother said this without cruelty, which was somehow worse than if she had said it cruelly, for it meant she had never even considered the alternative worth naming. "You have your uses, my dear. But a duke wants an ornament on his arm, not a girl who mends aprons and talks to the dairymaids as though they were her equals." Eleanor said nothing. She simply threaded her needle again and went on with Mrs. Fitch's apron, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like a complaint, and she had long ago decided that complaints from a plain daughter were the least dignified sound in the world. She was 23, past the age when a woman was still spoken of as a fresh prospect, with hair the colour of wet sand and eyes that were merely brown, not the celebrated green of her younger sisters. She had grown, over the years, a kind of quietness that some mistook for dullness, and a few, very few, recognized as something closer to steadiness. She managed the household accounts because her father could no longer bear to look at them. She knew the Christian names of every servant remaining in the house, down to the boy who blacked the boots, at a time when her mother could not have named 3 of them. She had learned, in the particular school that only the overlooked attend, how to be useful without being seen, and how to want things quietly enough that the wanting did not show on her face. It had not always been so plain a division between the sisters. As girls they had shared a nursery, a governess, a single pony they took, turns riding along the lane, and there had been a time, before their fortunes turned and their mother's disappointments hardened into favoritism, when Eleanor had been petted quite as much as Cassandra. But a family in decline, Eleanor had come to understand, does not distribute its griefs evenly. It finds a vessel to pour its disappointment into, and a vessel to pour its hope into, and somewhere in the slow years of watching the estate's fortunes dwindle, Mrs. Bennett had settled, without ever quite deciding to, upon Cassandra as the repository of everything the family still dared to want, and upon Eleanor as the one who would simply manage what remained. Cassandra herself was not naturally unkind. She had, in her own way, been shaped by the same narrowing of possibility, taught from the cradle that her beauty was the family's last asset, and that she must guard and deploy it accordingly. And there were still moments, rare but real, when some flash of the old childhood affection surfaced between the sisters unbidden, before duty and rivalry smoothed it over again. That evening, in the room she shared with no one, for even in poverty a daughter's dignity required her own chamber, Eleanor sat at the narrow window and watched the rain continue its slow work upon the glass. On the sill beside her stood a small clay pot of lavender, cut back hard for the coming winter, its dry stalks still faintly fragrant when she rubbed a sprig between her fingers. It was the one thing in the garden she had managed to save when the gardener was let go 2 years before. A modest, unfashionable plant, the sort no one admired, the sort that survived neglect, because it asked for nothing. She did not weep. She had trained herself out of weeping some years before, on the theory that tears solved nothing, and dried eyes at least allowed a person to see clearly. But she permitted herself, in the privacy of that small room, one long breath that was almost a sigh, and then she blew out the candle and went to bed, because tomorrow there would be linens to finish, and a mother to manage, and a sister to endure, and none of that required a woman with red eyes. Some 40 miles distant, in a townhouse on Grosvenor Square that had not seen its master in residence for the better part of a year, Adrian Ashworth, 9th Duke of Kentmere, sat alone in a study lit by a single branch of candles and read, for perhaps the 10th time, the contract his late father had drawn with a country gentleman named Bennett some 15 years before. It was, on its face, a simple document, the sort of arrangement two old friends might make over port and old grievances, a joining of the Ashworth and Bennett fortunes, a settlement sum that would relieve the Bennett family's considerable debts, a marriage to be arranged between the Duke of Kentmere and Miss Bennett once both parties came of a suitable age. His father, dying with the particular carelessness of a man who assumed he would live forever, had never specified which Bennett daughter was meant. There were two. The solicitors had shrugged over the matter for a fortnight before concluding that the choice, by the letter of the law, belonged to the Duke himself. Adrian did not want a wife. He wanted, if he was honest with the empty room and the guttering candles, to be left alone with the ruin he had inherited alongside the title, a dukedom mortgaged 3 ways past sensible by his father's gambling, tenant farms gone to seed, a staff he could barely pay, and a grief he had not yet found the bottom of. For his father's death had come hard on the heels of his older brothers, 2 losses within 18 months that had left Adrian, the spare who had never expected the weight of it, holding a coronet he had not asked for and did not particularly want. He was 26 and had already the look of a man 10 years older around the eyes, not unhandsome, for he had his father's strong jaw and his mother's dark coloring, but guarded in the particular way of men who have learned that softness is a luxury the ledger cannot afford. He did not gamble, unlike his father. He did not drink to excess, unlike half his acquaintance. He worked, late into the night, at columns of figures that refused to add up kindly, and he told no one, not his few remaining friends, not even his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, who alone among the family had ever troubled to ask how he did, that some nights the weight of it pressed on his chest like a physical thing, and he lay awake calculating which of his estates might be sold before the shame of it reached the newspapers. The marriage settlement was, in blunt terms, the only clean money left to him. He needed it as badly as the Bennets did, though pride kept him from admitting it in quite those words even to himself. He would go to Hartwell Grange then. He would look at both daughters, as the contract permitted him to do, and he would choose the one who seemed least likely to make his ruined life more complicated than it already was. That, at least, was his plan on the night before he set out. He arrived at Hartwell Grange 3 days ahead of the date he had named in his letter. A small deception he permitted himself out of a soldier's old habit. His brother's habit, really, learned from a brother who had served briefly before inheriting, and who had once told Adrian that a man learns more about an enemy's position by arriving before he is expected than by any amount of formal reconnaissance. Adrian was not entirely certain the Bennets were his enemies, but he was quite certain that a household warned of a duke's arrival would show him its best face, and he had had enough of best faces, painted over rot, to last a lifetime. He came, therefore, not in his own carriage with its ducal crest, but on horseback, in a plain brown coat, and gave his name at the local inn as Mr. Ashworth, a name true enough to pass for a lie of convenience, and let it be known he was a gentleman travelling on business, who required a room for a few nights, and perhaps some acquaintance with the local families, as he had heard the country hereabouts was fine for riding. It was in this unremarkable guise that he first saw Eleanor Bennett, though he did not yet know her name. He had ridden out early, before the household at Hartwell Grange was properly awake, along a lane that skirted the edge of what had once been a formal garden, and was now a tangle of overgrown box hedge and bramble, and he had stopped his horse at the sight of a woman on her knees in the wet grass, working with bare, reddened hands at the base of a rose bush that had clearly been strangled by weeds for longer than a single season could account for. She wore a plain grey gown with no ornament to it whatsoever, her hair coming loose from its pins, and she worked with the quiet, unhurried competence of someone who did not expect to be watched, and would not have altered her manner in the slightest had she known she was. A young kitchen boy, Adrian would later learn his name was Tam, came stumbling across the wet lawn toward her, sobbing, cradling one hand against his chest, and the woman rose at once, wiping her hands on her skirt without any evident concern for the state of the gown, and knelt again in front of the boy to look at what turned out to be a nasty cut across his palm, got from a broken jar he had dropped in the scullery. "There now," she said, and her voice carried, faint but clear, across the still morning air to where Adrian sat his horse, in the shadow of the lane. "You've not lost the hand, Tam, only frightened it a little. Let me see." She bound the cut with a strip of linen torn, without hesitation, from her own petticoat, and she did it deftly, as though she had done such things 100 times before, and she spoke to the boy the entire time, in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The roses, the coming frost, a story about a dog she'd had as a girl, until his sobbing eased and his shoulders came down from around his ears. When she had finished, she did not send him back to the kitchen to be scolded for his clumsiness. She walked with him herself, her hand light on his shoulder, and Adrian heard her say, "Tell Mrs. Fitch I said you're to have the rest of the jam with your bread this morning," for bravery, and the boy's face, when he turned it up to her, held an expression of pure and uncomplicated adoration that no amount of rank or beauty could have purchased. Adrian sat his horse a long while after they had gone in, turning something over slowly in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. He thought of his own household, of servants who flinched when spoken to, because his father had been careless with his temper in his final drink-soaked years. He thought of the ledgers waiting for him in London, the ruin he was meant to marry his way out of, and he thought that whoever the woman in the grey gown was, a poor relation perhaps, or a companion kept on out of charity, she was worth more to a household than any dowry could measure. He returned to the same lane the following morning, telling himself it was only that the riding suited him, that the country air did a man good after the closeness of London, and found her there again, this time weeding a bed of herbs near the kitchen garden wall, her sleeves pushed to the elbow despite the cold, humming some tuneless private song to herself that she plainly did not intend for any audience. He watched her set aside, without comment, a basket of the best herbs for what he took to be the housekeeper's kitchen, and a smaller, plainer bundle for what he later learned was a cottage at the edge of the estate, where an old tenant widow lived alone and half-blind, too proud to ask for charity, and too poor to do entirely without it. She did not know she was observed. That, more than any single act of kindness, was the thing that lodged itself in him, that her goodness cost her nothing in the way of performance, because she had never once considered that goodness might be a thing worth performing. He did not yet know she was Miss Bennett. He assumed, in fact, that she was not, for surely no mother would let a daughter destined for a duke's inspection kneel in wet grass, with reddened hands and a torn petticoat. It would be some days before the mistake was corrected, and by then it hardly mattered, for the choosing of it had already been made in some quiet chamber of his heart that his ledgers and his pride had not yet found a way to argue with. The formal call, when it came at last on the appointed day, was a production of considerable anxiety on the part of Mrs. Bennett, who had spent the intervening week in a fever of preparation. The drawing-room aired and dusted within an inch of its life, the last of the good china brought down from wherever it had been hidden from the bailiffs, Cassandra fitted and refitted into a gown of pale blue silk that had been let out, in the end, despite her protests, because vanity yielded to arithmetic when a dukedom was at stake. Cassandra Bennett was, it must be said, genuinely lovely, golden-haired, green-eyed, possessed of the kind of easy, sparkling charm that had made her the toast of every assembly within riding distance since she was 17. She had grown up being told she was destined for a brilliant match, and she had never had cause to doubt it. And so she entered the drawing-room on the appointed afternoon with the serene confidence of a woman collecting a debt long owed to her by fate. Eleanor had not been expected to attend the interview at all. Her mother had suggested, not unkindly but not gently either, that she might be more usefully occupied seeing to the tea things. But Mrs. Fitch, the housekeeper, a stout, sharp-eyed woman who had served the family for 30 years and loved Eleanor with the fierce, unspoken loyalty of a woman who had watched her grow up overlooked, had quietly insisted that Miss Eleanor bring in the tray herself, as is only proper when a gentleman calls. And so it was that when the Duke of Kentmere was announced, no longer Mr. Ashworth in a plain brown coat, but Adrian, Duke of Kentmere, in the dark, well-cut clothes of his rank, his bearing entirely altered by the simple fact of everyone in the room now knowing who he was, Eleanor entered a moment behind him, carrying the tea tray, and stopped dead in the doorway. He looked up. Their eyes met, and something in his face, the faintest widening, the smallest catch of breath, told her, with a lurch of pure horror, that this was the same gentleman who had watched her kneeling in the wet grass a week before, whom she had taken for a traveller of no particular consequence, to whom she had said nothing of significance beyond a few words about roses that she could not now, for her life, remember the exact substance of. "Your Grace, Mrs. Bennett was saying, all warm effusion, may I present my elder daughter, Miss Eleanor Bennett, and my younger, Miss Cassandra." Adrian rose. He bowed, first to Cassandra, as courtesy to age and precedence required, and then to Eleanor, and when he straightened his eyes held hers a beat longer than politeness demanded, and he said, in a voice pitched only for the room, not for her alone, though it felt to her as though it were Miss Bennett, "I believe we may have met before, in a manner of speaking." Cassandra laughed, delighted, assuming the remark for herself, and began at once a bright account of some assembly the previous winter, where she was certain their paths must have crossed, and Adrian allowed her the assumption with perfect courtesy, and said nothing further to correct it, and Eleanor set down the tea tray with hands that did not shake, though she could not have said, afterward, how she managed it. The visit lasted the better part of an hour, and by every outward measure it was Cassandra's triumph. She sparkled, she charmed, she spoke wittily of London and music, and the recent season, and Mrs. Bennett watched her with the glowing satisfaction of a woman seeing a lifetime's ambition come at last within reach. Eleanor said little. She poured the tea. She answered, when directly addressed, in short, plain sentences. She did not attempt to compete with her sister's brilliance, because it had never once occurred to her that competition was a possibility open to her. But she noticed, because she had spent a lifetime noticing things others missed, that the Duke's eyes came back to her again and again across the course of that hour, not with the polite, dutiful attention a gentleman pays to the less favored daughter of the house, but with something more searching. as though he were reading a book whose first page he had already found more interesting than the frontispiece had promised. When at last he rose to take his leave, he did not, as every convention of the visit demanded, address his final remarks to Cassandra or to Mrs. Bennett. He turned instead to Eleanor and said, "Miss Bennett, I understand you keep the roses at Hartwell yourself. I do what the gardener would do, if we had one." "Your Grace," she said, and heard, in her own voice, a steadiness she had not expected to find. "They are fortunate in their custodian," he said, and bowed, and was gone before Mrs. Bennett had entirely recovered her composure enough to work out what, precisely, had just occurred. It took 3 further days. 3 days in which Cassandra floated through the house humming and choosing fabric for wedding clothes she had not yet been promised, and Mrs. Bennett wrote letters to cousins hinting at glorious news to come, before the second letter arrived from Kentmere House, addressed, this time, with painful specificity, to Mr. Bennett, informing him that His Grace the Duke of Kentmere had made his selection under the terms of the contract, and that the lady in question was Miss Eleanor Bennett. The house did not, at first, believe it. Mrs. Bennett read the letter 3 times aloud, as though repetition might correct an obvious clerical error. Mr. Bennett, a quiet, defeated man who had aged a decade in the years since his fortunes turned, said only, with something that might almost have been the ghost of a smile, "Well, he has chosen the better daughter, whatever else may be said of it," which earned him a look from his wife of such wounded fury that he did not attempt the observation again. Cassandra's reaction, when it came, was not tears. Cassandra did not weep prettily, and knew it, and so declined to weep at all, but a white, controlled rage that settled over her like a second skin, and did not, in the months that followed, ever entirely lift. She said, that first evening, standing in the doorway of Eleanor's small room, while Eleanor sat very still with the letter in her own hands, "I hope you understand what you have done. I have done nothing, Cassandra. I did not ask for this." "You never ask for anything," Cassandra said. "You only wait, very quietly, until it falls into your lap, and then you look surprised, as though you had no hand in it at all. Everyone will laugh at him. You know, the Duke of Kentmere, passing over the beauty of the county for her plain elder sister. They will say he has taken pity on you, or that there is some scandal to explain it, because no one will believe a man chooses the drab thing over the diamond unless there is a reason hidden somewhere." Eleanor said nothing to this, because there was, in her sister's cruelty, a small kernel of a fear she recognized in herself, that she was not chosen for anything she had done or was, but for some private, unfathomable reason of the Duke's own that had nothing to do with her worth at all. She did not sleep well that night, but in the morning she rose and saw to the household accounts as she always did, and did not permit herself the indulgence of believing she was owed anything by way of explanation, because a lifetime of being overlooked had at least taught her not to demand what she had never been promised. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The wedding, when it came, was a quiet affair, conducted with more haste than ceremony, for the settlement that would save the Bennett family from ruin required only the marriage to be valid, not grand, and neither party had any great wish for spectacle. Eleanor stood before the small country altar, in a gown that had been her mother's, altered hastily to fit, and made her vows in a voice that did not waver, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, were cold as stones. Adrian watched her say them, and thought, not for the first time, that he had chosen a wife who did not perform her feelings for an audience, and found in that thought a rest he had not known he was starving for. They travelled to Ashworth Park, his principal seat, within the week, and it was there that the true shape of the marriage began, slowly, to reveal itself. Ashworth Park was, in its bones, a beautiful house, but it wore its neglect the way a person wears grief, in the dust that had settled over rooms no one thought worth the trouble of opening. In the conservatory, whose glass panes had cracked and never been mended, in a library whose shelves held the finest collection of books in 3 counties, all of them gone soft and foxed with damp, because no fire had been lit in that room in the better part of 2 years. Adrian's late wife had never lived to see the house. There had been no late wife, only a late brother, a late father. A chain of losses that had left Adrian moving through the rooms of his own inheritance, like a man walking through a house he did not quite believe belonged to him. Eleanor understood grief. She had lived, after all, in a house where the mother could not look kindly at the daughter who reminded her of everything the family had lost, and she recognized, in the shuttered rooms of Ashworth Park, the particular silence of a household that had forgotten how to hope. She did not ask permission to open the conservatory. She simply began, in her quiet way, to do it, first sweeping out the dead leaves and broken glass herself, before the housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Whitfield, who had served 3 generations of Ashworths and had watched the house's decline with a grief of her own that had nowhere to go, caught her at it, and after a long assessing look, sent 2 footmen to help. "You needn't do this yourself, Your Grace, Mrs." Whitfield said, not quite disapprovingly. On the 3rd morning she found the new Duchess on her knees in the broken glass with her sleeves pushed up. "I find I don't mind it," Eleanor said. It was much the same at home. Someone has to do the mending, or nothing is ever mended. Something in Mrs. Whitfield's face eased at that, some old vigilance relaxing by a degree, and from that morning on she became, without ever quite declaring it, Eleanor's ally in the house, the one who told her which tenants were struggling, and which merely complained out of habit, who taught her the names of every maid and footman within a fortnight, who mentioned, once, over tea, that his Grace had not slept a full night through since his brother's funeral, information offered with no evident purpose beyond the quiet suggestion that a wife who wished to be useful to her husband might begin there. Eleanor did not press him. She had learned, in 23 years of watching people who did not wish to be watched, that grief opened itself only when it was not asked to, and so she simply began to make herself present in the places he was, bringing a tray of tea to the study on the nights his candle burned past midnight, not with any word of concern attached to it, only setting it down and withdrawing again, until the 4th or 5th night, when he looked up from his ledgers and said, "You needn't trouble yourself on my account, Eleanor," and she said, mildly, "It is no trouble. I was making tea for myself in any case," which was not, strictly, true, but which allowed him the dignity of accepting the kindness without having to acknowledge that he needed it. He began, by slow degrees, to talk to her, not of grand things at first, of the state of a tenant farm, of a horse he was considering purchasing, of some small vexation with a neighboring landholder, but the talking itself was new, a habit he had not practiced with another soul since his brother died, and Eleanor received each small offering with the same steady, unhurried attention she had once given a crying kitchen boy, never grasping for more than was given, which had the curious effect of making him wish to give more. There were other, smaller gestures too, the kind that accumulate so quietly between 2 people learning each other's rhythms that neither could afterward have named the precise evening they began. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong in the mornings, but preferred it milked in the evenings, and adjusted the tray accordingly, without being asked. She reordered the dining table, over the housekeeper's mild protest, so that husband and wife sat nearer each other at meals, rather than at the 2 distant ends the previous Duke and Duchess had always kept, a small change that made their evening meals, for the first time in years, feel like conversation rather than ceremony. He, in turn, began leaving the study door open on the nights he worked late. A wordless invitation she came, in time to understand and to accept, bringing her mending in to sit near the fire while he worked, the 2 of them companionable in a silence that asked nothing of either of them beyond simple presence. He noticed, too, that she never once complained of the cold in the unheated east wing, and had a fire laid in her sitting room every morning thereafter without comment, and she noticed that he had done it, and said nothing of that either, because some kindnesses are better received quietly than thanked loudly. The recognition had already happened for him, that morning in the wet garden, though it took him some months of marriage to understand what, precisely, he had recognized. It was not beauty, though he had come, by slow and surprising degrees, to think her lovely in a way that had nothing to do with the fashionable standard her sister so effortlessly met. It was that she asked for nothing, and gave everything, quietly without display, the way a person waters a plant, not because anyone is watching, but because the plant needs water. He had spent his whole life, since his father's decline began, surrounded by people who wanted something from him, his title, his money, his notice, and here, at last, was a woman who wanted only to mend what was broken, and asked no credit for the mending. The garden bloomed again that first spring. Under her hands, though it was smaller and plainer than the grand designs of his grandfather's day, she kept, deliberately, a patch of lavender near the conservatory door, the same modest, unfashionable plant she had saved from her mother's garden, and when Adrian asked her once why she troubled with so humble a flower when the whole of Ashworth Park's glasshouses might have furnished her with rarer blooms, she said only, "It asks for very little, and gives quite a lot in return if you let it." And he found, standing beside her in the new green quiet of the restored conservatory, that something in his chest that had been clenched for 2 years came, very slowly, unclenched. The Dowager Duchess, Adrian's grandmother, arrived at Ashworth Park that summer for an extended visit, a sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued old woman named Lady Margaret, who had buried a husband, a son, and a grandson within a decade, and had emerged from each loss more formidable rather than less. She had expected, she told Eleanor with characteristic bluntness on the second day of her stay, to find the younger Bennett girl installed as Duchess, and had been prepared to dislike whichever wife her grandson had settled on out of duty rather than affection. "I confess I am agreeably surprised," she said, watching Eleanor direct the under-gardener in the proper pruning of a rose that had gone leggy from neglect. "You have done more for this house in 4 months than I managed to do in the 4 years I lived here as its mistress." Adrian was a solemn boy even before the losses came. I had begun to fear he would be a solemn man forever. "He carries a great deal, Your Grace. He does, and he has never once, in my hearing, set any of it down in front of another living soul, until, I am told by Whitfield, quite recently." Lady Margaret regarded her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was closer to one than her face generally permitted. "Whatever you are doing, Eleanor, I would advise you to continue doing it." She stayed a fortnight longer than she had originally intended, and in that time she took it upon herself, in her blunt, unsentimental fashion, to teach Eleanor a great many things no one else had troubled to teach her, which of the neighboring families were worth cultivating, and which were merely loud, how to manage a room of quarreling tenants without raising her voice, how to wear authority as a duchess must, not as a performance, but as a plain fact requiring no apology. "You have spent your whole life," Lady Margaret told her one afternoon, over the account books. Eleanor still insisted on keeping herself, believing that taking up space was an imposition upon someone else's patience. "It is not. You are the Duchess of Kentmere now, and a duchess who apologizes for her own competence teaches every person beneath her to doubt her as well. Stand up straighter, my dear. You have earned the right." It was, in its way, the first unqualified praise Eleanor had received from an older woman in longer than she cared to reckon, and she carried it with her long after Lady Margaret's carriage had rolled back down the drive toward London. It was Lady Margaret, too, who first warned her, gently but without softening the substance of the warning, that Cassandra Bennett had come to London for the autumn season, and had been heard, in more than one drawing-room, to speak of her sister's marriage in terms that were not kind. "She says," Lady Margaret reported, over tea some weeks later, with the particular relish of a woman who enjoyed delivering unwelcome truths cleanly, rather than by half measures, "that there must have been some prior acquaintance between yourself and the Duke that the family concealed from proper notice, an implication, my dear, that I need not spell out, and one calculated to do you considerable harm, if it is allowed to take root." Eleanor felt the old familiar cold settle in her stomach, not surprise. Precisely, for she had expected some version of this from the moment she had seen her sister's face on the night the letter came, but a weary recognition that the peace of Ashworth Park had never been meant to last untroubled. She did not tell Adrian at once. It was a fault in her, perhaps, this instinct to absorb difficulty quietly, rather than hand it to someone else to carry, and it was Lady Margaret, in the end, who told him herself, over port, in blunt terms that left no room for a solemn man to retreat into his ledgers instead of his marriage. "Your wife is being slandered in London, Adrian, and she has said nothing to you of it, because she has spent her whole life absorbing unkindness without complaint, and does not yet understand that she is a duchess now, and duchesses are not obliged to bear insult in silence. I suggest you attend to it before it grows teeth." It grew teeth regardless, as these things do. By the time the family removed to London for the winter season, the whispers had taken a sharper shape, no longer vague insinuations of prior acquaintance, but an outright fabrication, traced, though never openly, to Cassandra's circle. That Eleanor had somehow contrived to trap the Duke through deception, that there had been some scandalous encounter between them before the marriage, a garbled, malicious distortion of the truth of the wet garden and the roses, that painted Eleanor not as a woman quietly chosen for her character, but as a schemer who had engineered her own rise. The whispers followed her into every drawing room. She felt them in the way certain hostesses' smiles grew fixed when she entered, in the way conversations paused a beat too long before resuming on safer ground, in the small, precise cruelty of being seated, at more than one dinner, below guests of considerably less consequence than a duchess ought properly to expect. She bore it as she had always borne such things, with a straight back and a quiet tongue, but it cost her something each time, a small erosion of the fragile new confidence she had begun, at Ashworth Park, to allow herself. The cruelty found sharper form at Lady Osgood's musical evening, some weeks before the Pemberton ball, when a card arrived at the Ashworth townhouse, with Eleanor's name misspelled in a manner too deliberate to be accident, and she arrived to find her place at the supper table quietly removed altogether, so that she stood a long, humiliating moment in the doorway, while a footman scrambled to fetch an extra chair from another room, under the watchful, unhelpful gaze of a dozen guests who had clearly been told to expect the oversight. Adrian had not been present that evening, detained by estate business, and Eleanor said nothing of it to him when he returned, telling herself it was a small thing, not worth troubling him over, until Mrs. Whitfield's counterpart in the London house let slip to Lady Margaret that the Duchess had come home from Lady Osgood's white and silent, and had eaten almost nothing at supper for 3 nights running. It was Lady Margaret, again, who carried the tale to Adrian, adding, with the particular sharpness she reserved for occasions requiring it, "You may forgive her silence, Adrian, for she has spent her whole life absorbing such wounds without complaint. But you are her husband, not merely her defender of last resort, and a man who waits for a ballroom scene before he acts has waited a great deal too long already." Adrian watched it happen, and felt something in himself harden into a resolve he had not, until that winter, fully possessed. He had spent so long guarding himself against feeling anything too deeply. Grief had taught him that feeling deeply only invited more grief, that it took him some weeks to recognize the thing rising in his chest, each time he saw his wife's composure falter by some infinitesimal degree that only a man who watched her closely would ever notice, as something closer to fury than to mere protectiveness. The matter came to its crisis at the Pemberton ball, one of the great fixtures of the season, attended by half the ton, including Cassandra Bennett, who had, by then, secured for herself a respectable if unspectacular engagement to a baronet of modest fortune, and who had never quite forgiven the world for the modesty of it. It was Cassandra herself, emboldened by wine and old grievance, and the presence of an audience large enough to make the humiliation permanent, who brought the matter into the open. She had been speaking, in a voice pitched to Carrie, to a cluster of acquaintances near the refreshment table, of certain circumstances surrounding her sister's marriage that she was not at liberty to discuss in full. Though I am sure you may draw your own conclusions, as everyone else has, and Eleanor, arriving at the edge of the group a moment too late to withdraw unnoticed, found the whole cluster's eyes swinging toward her with the particular hunger of people who sense a scene about to unfold. She said nothing. She simply waited. The seconds stretched. Somewhere behind her, the orchestra was tuning for the next set, indifferent to the small drama unfolding near the refreshment table, and Eleanor was aware, with the strange clarity that comes upon a person in the worst moments of exposure, of every detail of the room at once, the heat of too many candles, the particular sourness of Cassandra's smile, the way the cluster of listeners had gone very still and very interested, the fan someone nearby had stopped mid-motion, as though movement itself might cause her to miss a word. She thought, in that stretched silent moment, of the wet garden a year before, of Tam's bound hand, of a lifetime spent making herself small enough not to be a burden to anyone's notice, and she found, to her own faint surprise, that she did not this time feel the old urge to shrink. She simply stood, straight-backed, exactly as Lady Margaret had taught her, and waited for whatever was to come. It was Adrian, who crossed the room. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. The quiet authority of his bearing had always carried further than shouting ever could. He came to stand beside his wife, close enough that the gesture itself was unmistakable to everyone watching, and he said, into a silence that had gathered around them with the swiftness of a held breath, "I understand there is some question, Miss Cassandra, regarding the circumstances of my marriage. Let me settle it plainly, so that no one here need trouble themselves further with speculation." He told them, then, the truth, not the whole of it, not the private tenderness of the wet garden that belonged to no one but himself and Eleanor, but enough that he had observed, before ever the family knew his identity, an act of unremarked kindness performed by a woman who believed herself unwatched, and that it was that act, and not any scheme or deception, that had shown him the character he wished to marry. "I chose my wife," he said, "because I saw, before anyone thought to show me, exactly what kind of woman she is when she believes no one is looking. I have not, in the months since, found a single reason to doubt that first impression, and I have found a great many reasons to be grateful for it." He turned then, deliberately to Cassandra, and his voice, though still quiet, took on an edge that made more than one guest set down their glass. "I would ask you to consider, before you speak further on the subject of deception, which of us in this room has spent the better part of a year constructing a falsehood designed to wound an innocent woman out of envy for a match that was never, in fact, promised to you? The contract named only Miss Bennett. I chose which Miss Bennett I would marry, as was entirely my right, and I chose her for reasons that reflect a great deal of credit upon her, and none at all upon idle malice. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room recalibrating an entire season's worth of gossip in the space of a single breath. Cassandra's face had gone the color of old ash. She opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to attempt some final salvage of her dignity, and found in the massed, watchful faces around her no ally willing to meet her eye. Adrian did not wait for her answer. He turned back to Eleanor, and, in front of the whole gathered company, in a gesture that would be spoken of for seasons afterward, as the moment the Duke of Kentmere's marriage became the most romantic scandal London had seen in a decade, he took her hand, raised it, and said, simply, "I love my wife. I have been slow, perhaps, in saying so aloud, but I will not be slow in defending her, and I would have every person in this room understand that anyone who wishes to speak ill of her in future speaks ill of me as well." Something moved at the corner of his mouth then, not quite a smile. The almost. Eleanor did not weep, though she felt the old habit of tears rise dangerously close to the surface. She simply looked at him, and something passed between them, that needed no further words in front of an audience, and the ballroom, sensing the scene had reached its proper conclusion, began, by unspoken agreement, to return to its music and its dancing, leaving Cassandra to make what escape she could manage with what remained of her composure. The scandal, such as it had been, did not survive the week. What replaced it in the drawing rooms of London was an entirely different sort of talk. Admiring, faintly envious talk of the Duke of Kentmere's devotion to his plain, quiet duchess, of the fire in his defence of her, of the growing understanding that the Ashworth marriage, far from being the awkward, dutiful arrangement society had first assumed, was in fact something rather better than most of the fashionable matches paraded each season for form's sake alone. Cassandra's engagement to the baronet survived the scandal, though her standing in society did not fully recover for some years, and it was, perhaps, the only justice the story afforded her, not ruin, for Eleanor had never wished her sister ruin, only the quiet, undramatic consequence of having built a campaign of cruelty on foundations that could not, in the end, bear the weight of a duke's plain-spoken truth. A fortnight later, a short, stiff letter arrived at the Ashworth townhouse, in Cassandra's own hand, containing no apology in so many words, for pride did not permit her that much, but allowing in its careful phrasing that she had perhaps spoken with more heat than the occasion warranted, which Eleanor understood, from a sister who had never once in 23 years admitted fault of any kind, to be as near to contrition as she was likely ever to receive, and which she chose, for the sake of her own peace, rather than any obligation to forgive, to accept, without further comment. Eleanor and Adrian returned to Ashworth Park before the season's close, both of them glad, in the particular way of people who have discovered they prefer each other's company to any drawing rooms, to leave London's noise behind for the quieter conversations of the country. The house that had once held its breath in dust and silence had, by then, become something else entirely, a home in the truest sense, its rooms opened, its library reshelved and warmed by regular fires, its conservatory green and thriving, its servants greeted by name, and increasingly greeting their master and mistress in turn with the easy warmth of people no longer afraid of the household. They served. 8 months after the Pemberton ball, on a soft morning in early June, Eleanor stood in the conservatory, with a shawl around her shoulders against the last cool edge of spring, watching the lavender she had transplanted from her mother's garden, the autumn before send up its first tentative purple spikes among the more fashionable blooms Adrian had, without her asking, ordered planted around it, because he had come to understand, by then, exactly what that humble, unshowy plant meant to her. The house around her had changed almost past recognition from the shuttered, grieving place she had first entered as a bride uncertain of her welcome. The library fires were lit every evening now, and Adrian had taken, in the past winter, to reading aloud from whatever volume he had lately unearthed, while Eleanor sat with her mending, a habit neither of them had planned, and both had come, quietly, to depend upon. Tam, the kitchen boy whose cut hand had first drawn a duke's notice from a lane a year before, had been moved up to under footman that spring at Eleanor's quiet recommendation, and had taken to following her about the garden on his half-days, with the devoted, uncomplicated loyalty of a boy who had not forgotten, who had bound his hand and spoken kindly to him when no one else troubled to look. Mrs. Whitfield had stopped, some months before, addressing Eleanor with the careful formality of a servant uncertain of her mistress's temperament, and had begun instead to speak to her the way an old friend speaks to another, trading small confidences over the household accounts each week, with an ease that Eleanor treasured more than she could easily have explained to anyone who had not lived, as she had, so many years without it. He found her there, as he so often did in the early mornings now, and came to stand beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke, because the silence between them had long since stopped needing to be filled. "Mrs. Whitfield tells me," he said at last, "that you have been teaching the new under-gardener the proper pruning of roses. He says you have more knowledge of the matter than any hired man he has known." I had a great deal of practice, Your Grace, on a garden with no gardener at all, I am aware. He looked at her, and something in his face, over the months, had lost entirely the guarded, weary cast it had worn on the night she first met him properly, replaced by an ease she had not thought that first winter he possessed the capacity for. I have been meaning to tell you. Lady Margaret writes that she means to visit again in the autumn, and that she intends to bring, as she puts it, a small parcel of correspondence from your mother, who has apparently decided that a duchess for a daughter is worth the trouble of writing letters again. Eleanor laughed, a small, surprised sound, for her mother had written exactly twice in the 8 months since the wedding, both letters brief and stiffly correct, neither containing anything so warm as an apology. Though Eleanor had come to understand, with time, that her mother's coldness had never been chosen so much as inherited, a habit worn smooth by years of her own disappointments, and that forgiving it cost Eleanor less than carrying its weight had once done. I shall write back that she is welcome to visit when she wishes, Eleanor said. There is room enough in this house now for a great many people who once had none to give me. Adrian reached out and touched, briefly, the small purple spike of the nearest lavender stalk, the same modest, unfashionable plant that had asked for so little and given, in the end, so much. A marriage, a household, a life neither of them had believed themselves entitled to hope for. It asks very little, he said, echoing words she had spoken to him nearly a year before, in that same conservatory, when the glass had still been broken and the future between them entirely unwritten, and gives quite a lot in return, if you let it. So I have always found, she said, and took his offered arm, and together they walked the length of the conservatory in the soft June light, toward the house that had, by slow and patient degrees, become entirely and unmistakably their own. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.